The sun of 1878 beat down on the town of Redemption with the merciless force of a blacksmith's hammer. It was a place that existed more as a pause than a destination. A collection of tired wooden buildings hunkered low against the vast, unforgiving expanse that stretched between Arizona and New Mexico. The very air was thick with red dust, a fine powder that coated everything: the water trough, the drooping leaves of the lone cottonwood, the souls of the people who called it home. It settled in the lines of their faces and clung to the hems of their dresses, a constant reminder that the wilderness was not something you conquered, but something you endured. Inside the cool, shadowed interior of Hayes General Mercantile, Evelyn Hayes moved with the quiet efficiency of someone whose life was measured in predictable rhythms. At 20, her world was defined by the four walls of the store. Its scents were her seasons, the earthy aroma of burlap sacks filled with coffee beans, the sharp tang of vinegar from the pickle barrel, the clean smell of new denim, and the faint, sweet perfume of rock candy in glass jars. Her days were a litany of small, orderly tasks, weighing out flour with precise movements, stacking tins of peaches into neat pyramids, her fingers brushing away the ever-present dust. She was a good daughter, obedient and devout, her thoughts as neatly arranged as the bolts of calico on the shelves behind her. The town, with its simple truths and rigid judgments, was the only world she had ever known, and she had never felt the lack of another. The afternoon heat had driven most sensible folk indoors, leaving the store in a state of slumberous quiet. The only sounds were the lazy buzz of a fly trapped against a window pane and the soft thump-thump of Evelyn's hands as she shaped a mound of brown sugar. Her father was in the back, likely asleep in his chair, the local Gazette fallen to the floor. For Evelyn, this was peace. It was a life unburdened by difficult questions or sudden turns. It was safe. The jangling of the small brass bell above the door was a violent intrusion, as sharp and unexpected as a gunshot. Evelyn looked up, her hands still coated in sugar. A figure stood silhouetted against the blinding white glare of the street, a long, lean shadow that seemed to drink the light from the room. As he stepped inside and the door swung shut behind him, the bell giving a final, hesitant tinkle, his features resolved themselves in the dim light. He was a Navajo, not one of the few who sometimes came to the edge of town to trade, their faces impassive and their visits brief. This man was different. He carried himself with a stillness that was not passive, but coiled, like a predator at rest. He was tall, though his frame was gaunt, the sharp angles of his cheekbones and jaw suggesting a long acquaintance with hunger. He wore the dusty, trail-worn clothes of a man who had traveled far, but it was his eyes that held her. They were dark and deep-set, burning with a feverish intensity that seemed at odds with the profound weariness etched into the rest of his face. He looked to be a man of about 30 years, yet he carried the weight of a century in his gaze. Evelyn's heart gave a frightened little jump. She had been taught what to think of his people. Reverend Miller's Sunday sermons painted them as godless savages, a danger to be kept at a distance. Her hand instinctively went to the smooth, worn wood of the countertop, grounding herself in the familiar. He took a slow step forward, his worn moccasins making no sound on the floorboards. Then his body was seized by a cough. It was not a simple clearing of the throat, but a deep, racking spasm that tore up from his lungs, bending him over. He braced a hand against a barrel of nails to steady himself, his knuckles white. The sound was wet and raw, the sound of a body breaking from the inside out. When the fit passed, he straightened slowly, a sheen of sweat on his brow. He did not look embarrassed. He simply accepted it as a part of him. He raised his eyes and met hers again. The fire in them had not dimmed. "I need help," he said. His voice was a low rasp, scraped raw by the cough, but each word was clear, spoken with a precision that belied his condition. Evelyn swallowed, finding her own voice. "We have goods. What is it you're looking to trade for?" It was the standard question, the safe one. The man gave a slight shake of his head. The movement was economical, wasting no energy, not goods. He paused, his breath a faint, whistling sound in the quiet store. I need a guide. A prickle of unease ran down Evelyn's spine. This was not a request she had ever heard. A guide to where my father, he's not here right now. It was a small lie, a shield to hide behind. I do not need your father, the man said, his gaze unwavering. I need you. The air grew thick and heavy. The buzzing of the flies seemed to cease. Evelyn could feel the frantic beat of her own pulse in her ears. Me, I don't understand. I've never been farther than Miller's Creek. I can't guide anyone. You do not need to know the way, he explained, his voice patient, as if speaking to a child. I know the way. I need a companion, someone to walk the trail with me. He took another step closer. She could smell the dust and sweat on him, the scent of sagebrush and something else, something metallic and unwell. He stopped a few feet from the counter, respecting the barrier between them. My name is Takakota. He said I was a warrior of the Dine. Now, I am a man with a sickness in his lungs. The white doctor at the fort gave me a month, maybe less. The words dropped into the silence of the store like stones into a still pond, the ripples spreading out to touch every corner of Evelyn's sheltered world. A month. She looked at the hollows beneath his eyes, the faint tremor in his hand, and she knew he was not lying. Death was in this room with them. It clung to him like the dust on his clothes. I was taken from my home many years ago, he continued, his voice dropping lower, taking on a storyteller's cadence. I have been held in the white man's prisons, made to walk the long walk. My family, they are gone. My village is dust, but my spirit is not yet broken. I will not die in this parched land. Surrounded by the ghosts of what was taken from me, my home is in the mountains to the east, the Red Mountains, where the spirits of my ancestors wait. It is my right to die there, to be free in my last breath. Evelyn stared at him, speechless. The scale of his story, the raw pain in his words, was beyond anything she could comprehend. Her own life's tragedies consisted of a scolding from her father or a batch of burnt biscuits. This man spoke of loss on a scale that dwarfed her entire existence. A wave of pity washed over her, so potent it almost made her dizzy. It was a dangerous feeling. She knew. Pity was the first crack in the wall of prejudice. I am sorry for your troubles, she whispered, the words feeling small and inadequate. But what is this to do with me? This was it. The moment hung suspended in the thick, warm air. Takakota's burning gaze seemed to look right through her, past the starched collar of her dress and the neatly pinned hair, and see the untouched soul within. He saw the girl who had never known true hardship, never made a choice that wasn't first sanctioned by her father or her church. He saw her innocence not as a weakness, but as a form of untarnished strength. With only 1 month to live, he pleaded, his voice soft but carrying the weight of his entire world. Will you journey beside me? Virgin. The word struck her with a physical force. Virgin. He did not say it with malice or with crude intent. He said it as a title, a name. It was a statement of fact, a recognition of what she was in this world of harsh, brutal realities. She was purity. She was the unwritten page. He was asking her, the girl who had never lived, to bear witness to his death. Her mind reeled. The sheer madness of his request was staggering. A white woman, the daughter of the mercantile owner, disappearing into the wilderness with a dying Navajo warrior. The town would not call it an act of mercy. They would have other, uglier words. They would call her a traitor to her race, a fool, a woman of loose morals. Her father's heart would break, her reputation, the only currency a woman of her standing possessed, would be utterly destroyed. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of her pity. This was impossible. It was a fantasy born of a dying man's fevered mind. She opened her mouth to say no. The word was there, fully formed on her tongue. It was the only sane, rational, and safe answer. But she didn't say it. She looked at Takakota, and she saw not the savage of the Reverend's sermons, but a man fighting for the last shred of dignity the world had left him, the simple, profound right to choose the ground where his body would rest. His plea was not just for a guide. It was a cry for a single act of human kindness in a life that had been stripped of it. He was asking for a witness, so that his passing would not be a lonely, forgotten event in a hostile land. He was asking for freedom, and as she stood there, surrounded by the comfortable cage of her life, the stacked tins, the weighed sugar, the predictable days, a strange and terrifying thought bloomed in her mind. What did she know of freedom? Her entire life had been a journey beside others, following the path they laid out for her. She was a virgin not only of body, but of experience, of choice, of life itself. The red dust on the road outside was the edge of her map. Beyond it lay dragons and deserts, the unknown. Takakota was offering her a glimpse into that world. It was a terrifying, deadly invitation, and it was the first real choice she had ever been offered. He saw the war in her eyes. He did not press, did not add another word. He had laid his life, what little was left of it, at her feet. He simply stood, breathing his shallow, whistling breaths, and waited. The silence in the store was absolute. It was no longer a peaceful quiet, but a roaring void filled with the clash of two worlds, the safe, ordered world she knew, and the wild, uncertain world he represented. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the stillness. To say yes was to destroy her life. To say no was to deny the first stirrings of a conscience she never knew she possessed. It was to turn her back on a dying man's last hope, and she was not sure she could live with that, either. The last rays of the afternoon sun slanted through the grimy window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, lost souls. Evelyn's gaze drifted from Takakota's face to her own hands, resting on the counter. They were clean, pale, and steady. They were the hands of a girl. She wondered what they would look like after a month in the wilderness. She wondered what she would look like. A floorboard creaked in the back room. Her father was stirring. Time was running out. The creak of the floorboard was followed by the sound of a chair scraping against wood. "Evelyn," her father's voice called out, thick with sleep. "Anyone out there?" The sound, once the comforting backdrop of her life, now felt like the closing of a lock. In that instant, Evelyn Hayes made her choice. It wasn't a decision born of logic or reason. It was a silent, seismic shift deep within her soul. She met Takakota's intense gaze and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. A flicker of something relief, perhaps, or a shared understanding of the gravity of her ascent passed through his tired eyes. "Just a customer. Pa," she called back, her voice remarkably steady. "He's just leaving." She turned back to the warrior. "Wait for me," she whispered, her words barely audible. "Behind the livery stable. At moonrise." He held her gaze for a moment longer, then turned and slipped out of the store as silently as he had entered, the little brass bell mocking the quiet solemnity of their pact. The hours that followed were a blur of practiced normalcy. She sold a length of rope to a farmer, measured out 2 pounds of coffee for Mrs. Gable, who eyed her with bird-like suspicion, and helped her father with the evening inventory. Each familiar task felt like a betrayal, a final, secret farewell to the only life she had ever known. Every mundane object, a tin of cinnamon, a spool of thread, seemed to cry out, accusing her of this monumental treason, when the moon finally cast its pale, skeletal light over redemption. Evelyn moved with the quiet purpose of a thief. Her father was asleep, his soft snores a rhythm of the peace she was about to shatter. In her small room, she packed a canvas satchel not with the things a young woman might treasure, but with the things a survivor might need. A full canteen, a small sack of hardtack biscuits, and another of dried beef. The sharp knife her father used for cutting twine, and, tucked into the very bottom, a small, leather-bound journal and a pencil stub. She did not know why she took it, only that she felt a desperate need to have a place to put the things she was about to see. Her final act was to write a note. The pencil felt heavy and foreign in her hand. What could she possibly say? How could she explain an impulse she barely understood herself? In the end, the words were simple, stark, and utterly inadequate. Pa, I have gone to help someone. Do not worry. I will be safe. I love you, Evelyn. She left the note on her pillow, a white flag of surrender to a life she was abandoning. Slipping out the back door was like stepping off a cliff. The night air was cool, a relief after the day's oppressive heat. She moved through the familiar alleyways, now rendered strange and menacing by the shadows. Every dog's bark, every distant shutter's bang, sent a jolt of terror through her. She half expected the whole town to erupt from their homes, pointing and shouting, dragging her back to the safety of her room. But no one came. Takakota was waiting, a motionless silhouette beside the dark bulk of the livery. He carried a small pack and a water skin, and in his hand was a long, sturdy walking stick. He said nothing, merely nodded and turned east, and Evelyn, with a final, heart-wrenching glance back at the sleeping town that had been her entire world, followed him into the vast, waiting darkness of the desert. The first days were a lesson in a kind of suffering she had never imagined. Her sturdy church shoes, not meant for such a trek, rubbed her heels raw within the first few miles. The muscles in her legs and back screamed in protest. The sun was a physical weight, pressing down on her, stealing the moisture from her body and the clarity from her mind. The silence was the worst part. It was not the peaceful quiet of the store, but a living, breathing entity, vast and indifferent. It pressed in on her ears, magnifying the sound of her own ragged breathing and the thudding of her terrified heart. Takakota walked with a slow, deliberate pace, a rhythm of conservation. He never seemed to tire, though occasionally a deep, rattling cough would force him to stop, leaning on his stick until the spasm passed. He never complained. He never spoke unless it was necessary. Her presence in redemption did not go unnoticed. The whispers started before the sun had fully risen on her empty bed. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose piety was matched only by her sharp-eyed curiosity, had seen her slip past the livery. The stable boy had seen her meet the Navajo. By noon, the story was on everyone's lips, repeated with a mixture of shock and a kind of grim satisfaction. "Hayes, girl. Run off with that Indian." The words were a brand, searing her name from the town's ledger of decent folk. They imagined her bewitched, or worse, a willing participant in her own ruin. The scorn was a tangible thing, a wave of judgment that followed her out into the wilderness, a burden heavier than the pack on her back. Evelyn was blissfully unaware of the specifics, but she felt the weight of their collective contempt as surely as she felt the heat. It was the price of her choice. Her transformation from a shopkeeper's daughter to a traveler began on the first night. When they stopped in the shelter of a rock outcropping, Takakota gestured for her to make a fire. It was a simple command, but for Evelyn, it was an insurmountable challenge. Her hands, so adept at tying neat bows on packages, were clumsy and useless with flint and steel. The spark she managed to create died instantly in the dry tinder she had gathered. Frustration brought tears to her eyes. She was a fool, a helpless child. After watching her struggle in silence, Takakota knelt beside her. He didn't scold or mock her, wordlessly. He took the flint and steel. He showed her how to find the feathery, bone-dry heart of a dead sagebrush, how to build a small, protected nest of the finest fibers. He struck the flint once, a single, sharp motion. A spark caught, smoldered, and with a gentle, patient breath from him, bloomed into a tiny, precious flame. He looked at her, then, and his expression was not one of pity, but of instruction. "This," his eyes said, "is how you survive." Day by day, the desert became her classroom, and Takakota her silent tutor. He taught her a new language, one written in the sand and spoken by the wind. He would stop and point to a set of tracks, tracing the delicate, hopping pattern of a kangaroo rat with his finger, then contrasting it with the purposeful, straight line of a coyote. He showed her how to find water, not in a flowing stream, but by digging at the base of a cottonwood, its deep roots a sign of hidden moisture. She learned that the desert was not empty, but teeming with life, a complex and intricate world she had been blind to. She, in turn, learned to be quiet. Her city-bred need to fill silence with chatter slowly evaporated in the vast emptiness. She learned to listen to the rustle of a lizard in the brush, to the subtle shift in the wind that might signal a change in weather. She started to observe, truly observe, the way the light changed on the distant mesas throughout the day. The different shades of red and brown in the rocks. Her world, once confined to four walls, expanded to the horizon. A tentative, fragile bond began to form between them in the spaces between words. It was built on the shared ritual of the trail, the morning breaking of camp, the long hours of walking, the evening fire. He would hand her a piece of jerky without a word. She would ensure his water skin was filled first. It was a partnership born of necessity, but it was slowly becoming something more. Trust. One afternoon, as they crossed a wide, sun-baked plain, his coughing started. It was worse than usual, a violent, prolonged seizure that left him gasping for air, leaning heavily on her for support. A fleck of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. Panic seized her. She lowered him to the ground, his body trembling, and fumbled for her canteen, pressing it to his lips. He drank greedily, his eyes closed. When the fit subsided, he lay still, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. Evelyn sat beside him, her hand hovering uselessly over his shoulder. The reality of his illness, of the 1 month he had spoken of, was suddenly, terrifyingly real. He was not an invincible wilderness guide. He was a dying man, and she was all he had. He opened his eyes and looked at her. The feverish fire was dimmed, replaced by a profound vulnerability. There was no pretense between them in that moment. He saw her fear, her inadequacy. She saw his pain, his mortality. In that shared, silent gaze, something shifted. He was not just the Navajo, and she was no longer the virgin he had named in the store. They were two people, alone, at the mercy of the vast, indifferent land, bound by a promise. He pushed himself up slowly. "We must keep moving," he rasped. "The sun does not wait." She nodded, helping him to his feet. As they resumed their slow, eastward trek, Evelyn looked down at her hands. They were no longer the pale, soft hands of a storekeeper's daughter. They were scratched, blistered, and stained with dirt and soot. They were the hands of a woman who could build a fire, who could find water, who could offer comfort to a dying man. The town of redemption felt a lifetime away. The journey had stripped her of her name, her reputation, and her past, and in their place, it was slowly, painfully, giving her a self she had never known existed. The days on the trail were a crucible of sun and silence, forging a new reality for Evelyn with every step. But it was the nights that reshaped her soul, when the sun bled out across the horizon, leaving the sky bruised with purple and orange. The brutal heat of the day gave way to a profound, bone-deep chill. The desert became a different world, a place of sharp shadows and endless constellations. Their campfire was a tiny, flickering star on the vast, dark floor of the earth, a fragile beacon against the immense loneliness of the landscape. It was here, in the intimate circle of light, that Takakota began to speak. In the beginning, his words were as sparse as the desert vegetation. He would point out a constellation, naming it in his tongue, Dain Bizad, before giving her the English name he had learned. He spoke of the sky people as if they were relatives, watching over them on their journey. But as the first week bled into the second, and the rhythm of their shared hardship became a form of unspoken language, he started to share the fragments of the life the world had tried to erase. He never began a story with a formal opening. He would simply stare into the dancing flames, his face a mask of light and shadow, and a memory would surface, carried on the cool night air. "The wind," he said one evening, his voice a low murmur that barely disturbed the quiet crackle of the fire. "My father taught me it is the voice of the holy people, the ancestors who shaped this land. They are always with us. When you feel it on your face, it is a reminder that you do not walk alone." He paused, listening to a sudden gust that whispered through the rocks above them, making the fire dance. It also warned us of the bluecoats. Evelyn sat perfectly still, her hands wrapped around a warm tin cup. She learned quickly that to interrupt with questions was to break the spell. Her role was to listen, to bear witness. "I was just a boy," Takakota said, his eyes drifting into the embers. "No older than the young tree we took our firewood from today. We were following the seasons, as our people always have. The soldiers came at dawn. The wind tried to warn us, but their horses were too swift. We had no choice but to run." He did not describe a battle. He described the terror of a child, the chaos of families scattering, the heart-stopping thunder of hooves on hard-packed earth, the shouts of men in a language he did not understand. He spoke of hiding in a ravine with his younger sister, her small hand clamped over his mouth to stifle her terrified sobs, while the world above them was torn apart. He spoke not with anger, but with a deep, hollowed-out sorrow, the sound of a wound that had never healed. In that moment, everything Reverend Miller had ever preached about godless savages and righteous expansion turned to ash in Evelyn's mind. The savage was not the man sitting before her, speaking of his terror. The savagery was in the thunder of the hooves, in the forces that had hunted a child through the canyons of his own home, night after night. The fire became a sacred space where the past was allowed to live again. The flames were memory, and the wind was the breath of ghosts. He told her of Hozo, the Navajo concept of living in balance and harmony with the world. A philosophy so beautiful and profound it made her own faith feel like a set of rigid, unforgiving rules. He spoke of his mother, a weaver, whose hands could turn dyed wool into stories of the creation, her fingers moving like spiders dancing on a loom. One night, when his cough was particularly bad and had left him weak and breathless, he spoke of his sister again. Her name was Shadia, which meant sunshine. "She did not die from a soldier's bullet," he said, his voice raspy. He stared into the darkness beyond the fire, as if he could see her there. It was the coughing sickness. In the camp at Bosque Redondo, they called it the long walk. We walked until our feet bled, and they put us on land that hated us. The water was bad. The crops failed. The sickness came and lived in the lodges like a wolf. It took the old first, then the very young. He described, holding his sister's hand as her breath grew shallow, her small body burning with fever. He spoke of the helplessness, of the medicine man's chants being drowned out by the weeping of a dozen other families losing their own. Evelyn felt a tear trace a clean path through the grime on her cheek. This was not a story from a book. This was his life. The cruelty of it was a physical weight in the air around them. "Before my father died," Takakota said, his voice regaining some of its strength, "he was teaching me the blessing way, the ceremony to prepare a warrior for his final journey. It is a song of harmony. It tells the spirits that you are ready, that you have lived in beauty and will return to beauty. It ensures your spirit will not be lost, wandering between worlds." He coughed, a dry, painful bark. We never finished the song. Now she understood. This journey was not just about the location of his body. It was about the destination of his soul. He was seeking not just a place, but a state of grace, the completion of a sacred rite that had been stolen from him. That night, after Takakota had fallen into a fitful sleep, his breathing a shallow whisper, Evelyn retrieved her small journal by the faint, glowing light of the dying embers. She opened it to a clean page. The pencil felt sure in her hand. She thought of his stories, of the immense dignity with which he carried his suffering, of the deep wisdom in his words. He was a part of this harsh, beautiful land in a way she could never be. Yet he was also a victim of its most brutal instincts. She pressed the pencil to the page and wrote, the words flowing from a place of newfound certainty. He does not belong to this land's cruelty, yet he walks it with grace. She closed the journal, the simple sentence feeling more true than anything she had ever been taught in a church pew. Looking at his sleeping form, she saw more than a dying man. She saw the last ember of a vibrant, living culture that had been systematically smothered. His memories, shared around their small fire, were an act of defiance. His quest to finish his song was a final, desperate act of rebellion, a claim to his own spirit in a world that had claimed everything else. The moon rose high, bathing the desert in an ethereal, silver light. The call of a distant coyote echoed through the stillness, a lonely, mournful sound. For the first time, Evelyn didn't find it frightening. It sounded like a lament. It sounded like a prayer. She pulled her thin blanket tighter, her gaze fixed on the man who had shattered her world only to rebuild it with his stories, one campfire at a time. The line between fear and compassion, between stranger and companion, had dissolved completely, leaving only a shared, fragile humanity flickering in the vast, silent dark. The land began to change. The endless, flat expanses of sun-baked earth gradually gave way to a more broken country. Mesas, like great slumbering beasts, rose from the plains. Their flanks streaked with umber and ochre. The journey became harder, the path winding through narrow, rock-strewn arroyos and up steep, gravelly inclines. The strain was telling on Takakota. The silences between his coughing fits grew shorter, and he leaned more heavily on his walking stick. Yet, a new light had entered his eyes, a feverish, almost desperate sense of anticipation. He was nearing a place of significance. Evelyn could feel it in the very air, a tension that hummed just beneath the silence. They rounded a massive buttress of red sandstone late one afternoon, and the ground before them opened into a shallow, protected valley, a small, seasonal creek bed, now bone dry, snaked through its center, marked by a line of skeletal, gray-barked cottonwoods, and there, scattered along the banks of the dry creek, were the ruins. Evelyn stopped, her breath catching in her throat. It was not a place of ancient mystery. This was a place of recent and violent death. The shapes were unmistakable, the collapsed, circular foundations of several hogans. Their timber frames charred and splintered, their earthen walls melted back into the ground by years of sun and rain. The silence here was different. It wasn't the empty silence of the open desert. It was a heavy, listening silence, thick with things left unsaid. It was the silence of a graveyard. She looked at Takakota. He had frozen mid-stride, his face a mask of confusion, as if his memory were wrestling with the reality before him. He took a few slow, hesitant steps forward, his eyes scanning the scene, moving from one ruined dwelling to the next. He was like a man trying to read a cherished book whose pages had been ripped out and burned. Then, his gaze locked onto a particular spot, a larger, more defined circle of fallen timbers near the base of a tall, solitary rock formation that resembled a watching sentinel. A low sound escaped his throat, a noise of such profound agony it seemed to tear its way out of him. It was the sound of a soul recognizing its own desecration. He began to walk, then stumble, toward the ruin. Evelyn watched, her heart clenching, as he knelt beside the charred remains. He reached out a trembling hand and touched a blackened piece of timber, his fingers tracing the grain as if it were the lines on a familiar face. And then he broke. It was not a loud, theatrical collapse. It was a quiet, internal implosion. His shoulders slumped, his spine seemed to dissolve, and he sank to the earth. He curled forward, his forehead touching the dusty, ash-strewn ground, his body racked with silent, shuddering sobs. The sight was more devastating than any cry. It was the complete and utter surrender of a man who had held himself together with sheer will for so long, only to find the place he called home was nothing but a ghost. Evelyn stood rooted to the spot, a helpless witness to a grief so immense it felt like a sacrilege to even breathe the same air. This was his village. This was the home he had been fighting his way back to. This was the place his mother wove her stories, where his father taught him of the wind, and this was its grave. She could see it all now through his eyes. This wasn't just a collection of ruins. It was a constellation of shattered lives. The dark circle of stones that might have been a fire pit was not just stones. It was the heart of a home, where his family had gathered. The scattered, broken shards of pottery glittering in the dust were not just clay. They were the cup his sister had drunk from, the bowl that had held his mother's stew. The whole landscape was screaming a story of loss, and until this moment, she had been deaf to it. His quiet sobs subsided, replaced by a low, guttural murmur. At first, she couldn't make out the sounds. Then she realized he was speaking names, whispering them into the earth as if planting them like seeds in the hope they might grow again. Shadia. The name was a sigh of heartbreak. His sister, Azza. Tsega. The names continued, a litany of the dead, each one a fresh stab of pain. He was calling the roll of his lost world, his voice the only headstone they would ever have. Evelyn's own grief was a pale, useless thing in the face of his. The social ruin she had feared for herself in redemption seemed like a child's vanity. She was watching the death of a nation, played out in the trembling shoulders of one man. The bluecoats he had spoken of were no longer a vague, historical force. They were a palpable presence here. Their ghosts, and the ghosts of their actions, haunted this valley, their cruelty baked into the very soil. She did not move. She did not offer empty words of comfort. What comfort could there be for this? Her presence was an intrusion, her white skin a symbol of the people who had done this. But she did not leave. To turn away would be the greater sin. Takakota had asked her to journey beside him, and this, she now understood, was the heart of that journey. It was not just to walk a trail, but to bear the weight of his memory with him. So she stood, her hands clenched at her sides, and she watched, and she remembered. As dusk fell, he finally stirred. He pushed himself up slowly, his movement stiff and ancient. His face, in the fading light, was hollowed out, his eyes like scorched pits in the earth. He looked at her, but his gaze seemed to pass right through her, focused on a duty that transcended his pain. Without a word, he began to move through the ruins. He gathered stones, small, flat ones, and brought them back to the center of what was once his home. He collected dried sagebrush and a few sparse, hardy herbs she did not recognize. He built a small pyre, not for warmth, but for ceremony. When darkness was complete, he lit the fire. The flames cast long, dancing shadows that made the ruined hogans seem to groan and shift. Then he began to chant. It was not a song of sorrow. The melody was low, repetitive, and deeply resonant. It was a language of the earth, of the wind, of the stones. Evelyn sat a respectful distance away, watching, listening. She did not understand a single word, but she understood everything. She understood that he was honoring the dead, that he was speaking to their spirits, that he was trying to restore a piece of the hozo, the balance, that had been so violently shattered here. He was tending to the memory of his people, ensuring they were not forgotten. It was the most profound act of faith she had ever witnessed, He chanted for what seemed like hours, his voice rising and falling with the pulse of the night. The moon climbed high, bathing the Valley of Ghosts in its cold, silver light. Finally, his voice trailed off into silence. He remained kneeling before the small, ceremonial fire, his head bowed, his body utterly still. The ritual was over. He was an empty vessel, having poured out the last of his strength, his memories, and his grief as an offering. Slowly, Evelyn rose. She walked toward him, her footsteps making no sound in the soft dust. The space between them felt sacred, and she was afraid to violate it, but the sight of him, so alone in his devastation, so spiritually and physically spent, overrode her hesitation. This was a moment that called for more than silent witness. It called for a human connection, a bridge across the unbridgeable gulf of their two worlds. She stopped just behind him. She could feel the weariness radiating from him like heat. She raised her hand, her fingers trembling slightly, and then she placed it gently on his shoulder. He did not flinch. He did not move at all for a long moment. The fabric of his worn shirt was rough beneath her palm, and through it, she could feel the sharp, frail bones of his shoulder blade. The touch was not one of pity, nor of desire. It was an anchor. It was a simple, declarative statement. You are not alone. I am here. I see. After a long silence, he slowly lifted his head. He didn't turn to look at her, but kept his gaze on the dying embers of his memorial fire, on the moonlit ruins of his life. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a raw, broken whisper, scraped clean of all artifice. You wanted to help a man, he said, the words barely audible. This is what you are helping, not just a sick body. You are helping to carry this. His head gestured almost imperceptibly to the desolation around them. This is the truth of this land. Not the empty spaces, but the spaces full of ghosts. He fell silent again, and she kept her hand on his shoulder, a small point of warmth in the vast, cold emptiness. He took a slow, rattling breath. If you journey beside me, Virgin, he said, the old name returning, but with a completely new meaning, you'll see what this land truly means. The word was no longer a simple description of her innocence. It was a recognition of it, a name for the unscarred soul he had chosen to witness the deepest scars of his own. In the store, he had asked for a companion. Here, in the ruins of his heart, he was showing her exactly what that meant. It meant seeing the beauty and the horror, the grace and the cruelty, all at once. It meant seeing the truth. And in that moment, with her hand resting on his shoulder in a silent covenant of shared sorrow, Evelyn Hayes knew she would never be able to look away again. Leaving the Valley of Ghosts was like waking from a trance. The raw, intimate sorrow of that night lingered between them, a silent testament to what they had shared, but the desert did not permit them to dwell in the past. It demanded forward motion, a relentless focus on the immediate tasks of survival, finding water, reading the trail, and conserving what little strength Takakota had left. The ritual and the release of his long-held grief had taken a visible toll. He was quieter, more withdrawn, his energy a flickering candle flame that Evelyn feared the slightest breeze could extinguish. The journey had become a race against the slow, internal clock of his disease. What they did not know was that another clock was ticking, its hands pushed forward by greed and gossip. The story of Evelyn Hayes, the quiet girl from the general store, had mutated as it spread from redemption. What began as a shocked whisper of a girl who had run off with an Indian had twisted into a far more sinister and profitable tale. In the saloons and dusty outposts of the territory, she was no longer a runaway. She was a victim. A pure white woman abducted by a savage Navajo buck. It was a story that sold newspapers and stirred outrage, a story that made men feel righteous in their prejudice, and for a certain kind of man, it was a story with a price tag. 3 such men picked up the trail 2 days out of redemption. They were not lawmen. They were bounty hunters, vultures who circled the fringes of society, drawn by the scent of desperation and coin. The leader was a man named Silas Croft, a former tracker for the army with a sour disposition and eyes the color of faded denim. His companions were the Miller brothers, Jeb and Hank, 2 brutish men who shared a single sluggish mind between them. A distraught father in redemption, half mad with worry and shame, had scraped together a reward for his daughter's safe return. To men like Silas, the word safe was flexible. The reward was not. Evelyn and Takakota were unaware of the shadow that now dogged their steps. Their focus was eastward, toward the distant, hazy peaks of the mountains that were Takakota's final destination. The land grew harsher, a cracked and blistering plain of alkali flats that shimmered with heat mirages. Water became their obsession. Their canteens were perilously light, and the signs of moisture Takakota had taught Evelyn to read were nowhere to be found. It was Takakota who sensed them first. He didn't see or hear them. It was a change in the air, a prickling on his skin, the instinct of a man who had spent a lifetime being hunted. He stopped abruptly, his head cocked, his gaze sweeping the back trail.
"What is it?"
Evelyn asked, her voice raspy from thirst. "We are not alone," he said, his voice low. A cold dread, separate from the heat and exhaustion, washed over Evelyn. She looked back, seeing nothing but the blinding glare of the sun on the white earth. "Who?" "Men who follow for money. I have seen their kind before." He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw a new kind of pain. It was not for himself, but for her. He had led her out of the safety of her world and into this danger. The burden of that knowledge seemed to weigh more heavily on him than his sickness. "We must hide." He led them into a labyrinth of canyons, a maze of narrow passages and towering rock walls that offered shade, but no escape. For a day, they twisted and turned through the ancient water-carved corridors. The pursuit remained distant, a feeling rather than a certainty, but their water was gone. Their lips cracked. Their throats felt as if they were lined with sand, and the world began to waver at the edges. Then the wind began to rise. It started as a whisper, a sigh through the canyons, but it grew steadily into a mournful howl. The sky, once a brilliant, merciless blue, turned a sickly yellow-brown as the wind picked up the topsoil of the plains. "A sandstorm," Takakota rasped, his voice barely audible over the rising gale. "We must find shelter, now." He found a shallow overhang, a scoop in the rock face that offered minimal protection. They huddled together as the world outside dissolved into a roaring, blinding chaos. The sand was not like dust. It was a physical force, a scouring wave of grit that stung their skin and filled their eyes, mouths, and lungs. The wind shrieked, a furious, elemental scream that seemed intent on tearing the very rocks apart. This storm was more than weather. It was the physical manifestation of the world's judgment. It was the scorn of redemption, the lies of the saloons, the greed of the men who hunted them. It was the chaos and prejudice of the world they had tried to escape, now roaring down upon them, trying to suffocate them, to bury them alive. Huddled in the dark, with the grit filling her lungs and the roar deafening her. Evelyn's faith wavered. The trust she had built in Takakota, in their journey, felt fragile against this onslaught. This was madness. She was going to die here, buried in an unmarked grave, for a promise made to a dying man. The storm raged for what felt like an eternity. They huddled together for warmth and stability. 2 small, fragile beings against the immense, indifferent power of the storm. When it finally abated, the world was remade. The landscape was smooth and sculpted, the air thick with a hazy silence, but the reprieve was short-lived. In the eerie quiet that followed the storm, they heard the dislodged clatter of a stone from the canyon rim above, followed by a low, gruff voice. "See anything, Silas?" "Tracks are gone, but they're in here." Another voice replied, closer than the first. "The Indian knows these canyons. He's found a hole to die in. We just gotta find it." They were trapped. The hunters were above them, methodically searching the canyon system. Takakota's eyes met Evelyn's. The fire in them was nearly gone, replaced by a weary resignation. He was too weak to fight, too sick to run. "They will not take you," he whispered, his voice cracking. He started to push himself up, his intention clear to draw them away, to sacrifice himself. "No," Evelyn said, the words sharp and fierce. She grabbed his arm, surprised by her own strength. "We are in this together." She peered around the edge of their shallow cave. About 50 yards down the canyon, a narrow passage branched off, offering a potential escape route. But to reach it, they would have to cross an open stretch of ground, in full view of the rim above. Suddenly, a figure appeared on the ledge directly across from them. Silas Croft. He raised a rifle to his shoulder, not aiming at them, but scanning the canyon floor. Time stopped. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the moment her old self died completely. The compliant, frightened girl from Redemption vanished, burned away by the desert sun and the force of her conviction. In her place was a woman who had learned to make a fire, to find water, and to honor the dead. A woman who would not let this journey end in a squalid, meaningless capture. In her satchel was the twine-cutting knife, but something else lay at the bottom. An object she had packed in a moment of foresight she hadn't understood at the time. It was a small, single-shot Derringer pistol her father kept under the counter, a relic of a past he never spoke of. She had cleaned it and loaded it, thinking it a foolish, dramatic gesture. Now, it felt like the hand of Providence. Her fingers closed around its smooth, cool grip. Her hands were shaking, but her resolve was iron. She was not a killer. She would not become one, but she was a protector. "When I tell you, run for that passage," she whispered to Takakota, her voice low and urgent. He looked from the pistol in her hand to her face, and his eyes widened in disbelief. He saw not a frightened girl, but a resolute woman, her jaw set, her eyes narrowed with a purpose that eclipsed her fear. "Evelyn," he started to protest. "Run." As Silas Croft's back was momentarily turned, she pushed Takakota out from behind the rock. "Go!" He hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then, seeing the unyielding determination in her eyes, he obeyed. He ran, his gait a stumbling, desperate shamble, toward the safety of the passage. Silas heard the movement and spun around, raising his rifle. "There!" he yelled to the others. Evelyn stepped out from the overhang. The world seemed to slow down. She raised the small pistol with both hands. The way she'd seen men do in town, it felt impossibly heavy. She didn't aim at the man. She aimed at the rock face a few feet to his right. She squeezed her eyes shut and pulled the trigger. The explosion was shockingly loud in the enclosed canyon, a sharp crack that echoed off the walls. A puff of dust and rock chips flew from the cliff face near Silas's head. He cursed and ducked back, startled more by the audacity of the shot than the danger. The bullet was a statement. We are not helpless prey. That single deafening shot was all the time Takakota needed. He scrambled into the narrow passage just as the other two hunters appeared on the rim, firing their own rifles wildly, their bullets ricocheting harmlessly off the canyon walls. Evelyn ducked back into the overhang, her ears ringing, the smell of gunpowder acrid in her nostrils. She had done it. She had fired a gun at another human being. A wave of nausea and terror washed over her, but beneath it was a bedrock of grim satisfaction. They escaped, under the cover of confusion. They navigated the narrow slot canyons, emerging miles away as twilight fell. They found a hidden spring, and the water was the sweetest thing Evelyn had ever tasted. That night, they sat by a small, smokeless fire, hidden deep within a cave, Evelyn's hands would not stop trembling. Takakota watched her for a long time, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He finally reached across the small fire and gently took her shaking hands in his. His own were hot with fever, but steady. He looked at her, and his eyes held a new light, the way he had looked at her before as a curiosity. An innocent, a compassionate child was gone. He was looking at an equal. He saw a woman who had faced down fear and violence, not for a reward, not for glory, but for a promise. A woman who had made a choice and sacrificed a piece of her own soul to honor it. "The girl I met in the store would not have done that," he said, his voice soft, full of a quiet awe. "She would have hidden. She would have prayed." He looked down at her hands, still holding them. "You are no longer the virgin of that quiet world." It was not a lament. It was a proclamation. He was releasing her from the name he had given her, from the box of innocence she had lived in. In his eyes, she had been reborn in the flash of gunpowder and the crucible of the storm. She was Evelyn, and she was a warrior in her own right. The escape from the bounty hunters had cost them dearly. It was not a price paid in blood or bullets, but in the finite, precious currency of Takakota's remaining strength. The desperate scramble through the canyons, the breathless flight, the constant tension, it had all been a debt drawn against a body that was already bankrupt. In the days that followed, Evelyn watched as the bill came due. He no longer walked with the steady, ground-covering pace of a guide. Each step became a conscious effort, his weight heavy on the walking stick. The rattling cough that had been his constant companion now came in prolonged, violent storms, leaving him doubled over, gasping, a sheen of cold sweat on his brow, the fire in his eyes, the one that had so captivated and frightened her in the store, was banked low, a bed of embers slowly being smothered by the ash of his illness. He was fading, and the mountains, their jagged peaks now a constant, taunting presence on the eastern horizon, seemed to be receding with every painful step he took. They found a temporary haven in a shallow box canyon, a dead-end fissure in the earth with high walls that offered shelter and a small, brackish seep of water that was life itself. It was here that his body finally surrendered. He tried to rise one morning and simply couldn't. A wave of dizziness and a fit of coughing sent him back to his bedroll, his body trembling with a fever that was no longer just a symptom, but a consuming fire. Evelyn's fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, the last vestiges of the girl who had depended on him to lead, to teach, to survive, were stripped away. Now, she was all he had. She was the hunter, the water carrier, the fire maker, the guardian. She snared two scrawny rabbits with the simple traps he had shown her how to make, the act of killing and skinning the small animals a grim but necessary rite of passage. She kept the fire going, her hands, once clumsy with flint and steel, now moving with a practiced economy. She was his anchor in a world that was dissolving around him. For 2 days, the sun beat down on their stone sanctuary. Takakota drifted in and out of consciousness, his sleep troubled by murmured words in his own language, his waking moments marked by a vacant, feverish stare. Evelyn did what she could, offering him sips of water, bathing his forehead with a damp cloth. She sat vigil, watching the slow, inexorable advance of his sickness, her heart aching with a profound sense of helplessness. On the 3rd afternoon, the world changed. A stillness fell over the canyon, the air growing heavy and humid. The relentless blue of the sky began to curdle, turning a bruised violet gray at the edges. A low, distant rumble echoed through the stone, a sound more felt than heard. Evelyn looked up, a strange hope fluttering in her chest. Then came the rain. It did not begin with a gentle patter. It was as if the sky simply broke open. A torrential downpour, a rare and violent desert monsoon, crashed into the canyon. Water poured over the cliffs in rust-colored waterfalls, and the dry, thirsty earth drank with a great, hissing sigh. The roar of it was immense, a cleansing, elemental sound that washed the dust from the air and the despair from Evelyn's heart. She dragged their meager supplies and a barely conscious Takakota deeper into the overhang of a shallow cave at the back of the canyon. Just as a flash flood, a roiling brown torrent, tore through the canyon floor where they had been camped moments before. Inside the cave, the world was reduced to the three of them herself, Takakota and the fire she had managed to keep alive, its flames casting a warm, dancing light against the damp stone. Outside, the storm raged, a curtain of water sealing them off from the world. The cool, damp air seemed to agitate his fever. He began to shiver violently, his teeth chattering. In his delirium, he thrashed, pushing away his blanket. In the struggle, his worn shirt pulled aside, revealing a long, jagged scrape along his ribs, a wound she hadn't noticed before, likely from their frantic escape through the rocks. It was inflamed and angry-looking, the skin around it red and puffy. Seeing it, a fierce, protective instinct rose in her, silencing her fear. She knew she had to clean it. She filled her small cooking pot with fresh rainwater from a cascade pouring off the rock face and set it near the fire to warm. She tore a strip from her own petticoat, the last vestige of her former life, the fabric soft and clean. She knelt beside him. "Takakota," she said softly, her voice steady. "I need to tend to this. It will help." He didn't seem to hear her. His eyes were open but unfocused, lost in some fevered dreamscape. Gently, she unbuttoned the front of his shirt and eased the rough fabric away from his torso. The sight of his chest, gaunt and scarred, the ribs stark beneath the skin, sent a pang of sorrow through her. This was the body that had endured prisons, forced marches, and starvation. It was a map of his suffering, with infinite care. She dipped the cloth into the warm water and began to clean the wound. Her touch was tentative at first, then grew more confident. She worked in silence, her movements rhythmic and focused. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the steady drumming of the rain outside, and his shallow, ragged breaths. The act was profoundly intimate, yet utterly devoid of the kind of intimacy she had read about in forbidden novels. This was something deeper, more elemental. It was an act of pure care, of one living being tending to another. Her hands, which had once measured sugar and stacked tins, were now tracing the lines of his suffering, trying to soothe a pain that went far deeper than a simple wound in the flesh. As she finished, she felt his eyes on her. His gaze was no longer vacant. The fever had momentarily broken, leaving a startling, lucid clarity. He was watching her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. In their depths, she saw no shame, no fear, only a profound and weary gratitude. Their gazes met and held across the small, flickering space between them. In that long, silent moment, the last boundaries dissolved. She was not a white woman, and he was not a Navajo warrior. The titles and labels the world had given them were meaningless here, washed away by the rain and burned away by the firelight. They were simply two souls, stripped down to their most essential selves, who had found each other in the vast wilderness of the world and their own hearts. The compassion she felt for him and the fierce, protective feeling that had taken root in her soul merged into something she could not name, but she knew it was the most real thing she had ever felt. It was a love born not of promises or prospects, but of shared hardship, witnessed pain, and a silent, unshakable trust. He slowly raised a hand, not to touch her, but as a simple gesture of acknowledgement. His voice, when he spoke, was a hoarse whisper, but it was imbued with the weight of a final, sacred truth. "If the spirits allow," he said, his eyes never leaving hers, "I'll walk beside you beyond this life." The words were not a proposal or a pretty sentiment. They were a vow, a spiritual promise that transcended the decay of his body and the certainty of his death. It was a declaration that the bond forged between them in the silent walks, the shared fireside stories, The terror of the chase and the quiet care of this cave was not bound by the confines of a single lifetime. A profound peace settled over Evelyn, a calm that was as deep and cleansing as the rain. She finally understood. Love was not the future her parents had planned for her, a safe and predictable path. It was not a promise of tomorrow. Love was the fierce, terrifying, beautiful now. It was the warmth of a fire in a storm. It was the weight of a life entrusted to her care. It was the absolute, unwavering truth of being present for another soul in their moment of greatest need. It required no future. Its eternity was contained entirely in the moment. She finished buttoning his shirt and gently pulled the blanket over him. He closed his eyes, his breathing already deepening into a more restful sleep. The crisis had passed. For now, the rain began to soften, its roar diminishing to a steady, soothing rhythm. Evelyn sat back on her heels, watching the man who had irrevocably altered the landscape of her entire existence. The journey to the Red Mountains was his, but the journey here, to this cave, in this moment, had been hers. And she had, at last, arrived. The rain had been a baptism, a brief and violent blessing that washed the world clean and filled their waterskins. It had granted Takakota a small reprieve, a flicker of strength that was just enough. In the week that followed, they moved with the slowness of a dream, the world around them sharpening into a crystalline clarity under the washed sky. The Red Mountains were no longer a distant promise on the horizon. They were a towering, majestic reality that filled their vision, their crimson and vermilion cliffs seeming to burn in the afternoon sun. They were his ancestors, cast in stone. They were his final destination. They reached the foothills as the third week of their journey was drawing to a close. The air grew thinner, cleaner, carrying the scent of pine and dry earth. Takakota, who had been moving with the grim, shuffling determination of a sleepwalker, stopped. He stood for a long time, his head tilted back, his gaze tracing the high, wind-swept ridges. A profound change came over him. The deep weariness in his bones seemed to be held at bay by a surge of spiritual energy, a final gathering of his life's force. This was the source. He was home. "There," he said, his voice a dry whisper, pointing with a trembling hand toward a specific saddle between two jagged peaks. "The place of the high ledge. It is where the wind speaks to the sky people. It is where my song will be finished." The climb was the final, brutal test of Evelyn's transformation. The path was not a path at all, but a steep, treacherous scramble over scree and through thorny brush. Takakota's borrowed strength was an illusion. It was a fire of the spirit, not the flesh. After 100 yards, his legs gave out. He did not fall, but simply stopped, his body swaying, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Evelyn was there. She moved to his side, her own lungs burning from the altitude and exertion, and slid her shoulder under his arm. "I have you," she said. The words not a question or an offer, but a statement of unwavering fact. He leaned his weight on her, a weight that was shockingly slight, the weight of a man already half given back to the earth. And so they began the ascent together, a single, struggling entity. She became his legs, his strength, his will to move. Her arm was wrapped firmly around his waist, his arm draped over her shoulders. Each step was a battle. Her muscles screamed. Her feet slipped on the loose rock, and the sun beat down upon them. But she did not falter. She planted her feet, braced her body, and moved them upward, inch by painful inch. This was the culmination of their journey, its truest expression. The girl who could not build a fire was now moving a man up a mountain. She was no longer walking beside him. She was carrying him. She was carrying his body, his hope, his history. With every agonizing step, she was fulfilling the promise made in the dusty silence of her father's store. The wind was their constant companion, a living presence. It flowed down from the high peaks, cool and strong, whipping her hair across her face and tearing at their clothes. It was the voice of his ancestors, and it seemed to be pulling him upward, calling him home. They reached the high ledge as the sun began its long descent, painting the western sky in strokes of fire and gold. It was a wide, flat shelf of rock, exposed to the sky on three sides, offering a view that seemed to encompass the entire world. The desert they had crossed was a vast, hazy tapestry of brown and gray below them. It was a place between earth and sky, a sacred altar carved by time. Takakota sank to the ground, his body spent. He leaned against a flat-topped boulder, his chest heaving, but his eyes were alive, burning with a calm, transcendent light. He had made it. The race was won. Evelyn knelt beside him, her own body trembling with exhaustion. He gave her a look of profound, unutterable gratitude, a look that conveyed everything that words never could. "Now," he whispered, his voice gaining a strange, resonant clarity. "We must prepare the way." He began to give her instructions, his voice soft but precise. He was no longer her patient, but her spiritual guide, initiating her into the final, sacred mystery. She became his hands, his acolyte. She gathered flat, red stones, their surfaces warmed by the last of the sun, and, following his direction, arranged them in a perfect circle on the center of the ledge, the circle of life, the path of the sun, the symbol of a journey without end. Next, he had her take the small deerskin pouch he wore around his neck. Inside were the herbs he had painstakingly gathered along their journey. There was sage, for cleansing the spirit. There were dried corn pollen and crushed turquoise, symbols of life and protection. He instructed her how to sprinkle the pollen in 4 straight lines within the circle, pointing to the 4 sacred directions. She worked with a focused reverence, her movements careful and deliberate. She was not merely following orders. She was participating in a rite that felt more real and true than any she had ever known. She was helping him mend the broken harmony of his life. The sun touched the horizon, and the world was bathed in a sublime, ethereal light. The red mountains glowed as if lit from within, and the wind sang a low, mournful song across the rock. The moment was suspended, perfect and holy. Takakota looked at the completed circle, then at Evelyn. His eyes were full of a deep, abiding peace. He had passed on what needed to be passed on. He had ensured the rites would be honored. "You have a good heart," he said, the words simple but carrying the weight of his final judgment. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers dry and hot. "You listened when the world was deaf." He took a slow, deep breath, a breath that seemed to draw in the light of the setting sun. "My father taught me," he said, his voice the quiet rustle of autumn leaves, "that all we are is a story. To live is to remember the stories of those who came before us. To die." He paused, his gaze meeting hers, imprinting his final lesson upon her soul, "is to be remembered." This was his legacy to her, the sacred duty that now fell to her. She was not just a witness, she was the vessel of his memory. She was the story that would be told. The last sliver of the sun dipped below the horizon. A wave of deep rose and violet washed across the sky. The wind grew still, in the profound silence. Takakota closed his eyes. His body relaxed against the stone. All the tension, all the pain, all the struggle of his life seeming to flow out of him. He let out a long, soft sigh, a sound not of suffering, but of release, of arrival. Evelyn watched, her hand still on his arm. She felt the last, faint tremor of life pass through him. And then he was still. His head was bowed slightly, and on his lips was the faintest trace of a smile. It was a smile of utter peace, of homecoming. He had died in freedom, on the sacred ground of his ancestors, his song complete. For a long time, Evelyn did not move. She remained kneeling beside him as the colors faded from the sky and the first diamond-bright stars appeared. The grief she had been holding at bay for weeks finally came. But it was not the frantic, tearing sorrow she might have expected. It was a deep, quiet, and overwhelming wave of love. Tears streamed down her face, silent and hot, tracing paths through the dust and grime of the journey. She did not sob or cry out. To do so would have felt like a violation of the profound peace that had settled on the mountaintop. Her tears were a salute, a final, wordless conversation with the man who had taught her what it meant to be truly alive. When her tears subsided, a quiet resolve took their place. He had taught her what to do. To die is to be remembered, with the stars as her only light. She began the final ritual. She followed the instructions he had given her in the quiet moments of their journey. She gently folded his arms across his chest. She sprinkled the last of the sacred pollen over him. She did not speak the Navajo words of the Blessing Way chant. They were not hers to speak, but she held the memory of his voice in her mind. Letting its cadence guide her hands, she worked through the night, her grief a steady, solemn companion. She was no longer Evelyn Hayes, the shopkeeper's daughter from Redemption. She was a keeper of the flame, a guardian of a story, the sole mourner at the final resting place of the last warrior of a lost village. And in the cold, clear, starlit silence of the high mountain, she was not afraid, and she was not alone. The journey down from the mountain was a descent into a world that no longer felt like her own. Evelyn moved through the canyons and across the plains with a newfound economy of motion. Her body hardened by the trail, her spirit settled into a deep, quiet calm. The desert, which had once been a terrifying, alien landscape, was now a familiar text. She saw the story of the wind in the sculpted dunes, the passage of life in the faintest tracks, the promise of water in the deep roots of a cottonwood. Takakota had given her new eyes, and she could never see the world the same way again. She was alone, but the profound loneliness she had feared was gone, replaced by a sense of companionship that transcended presence. He was in the whisper of the wind, the cry of the hawk, the unblinking gaze of the stars. She walked for 2 weeks, her path a straight line back to the life she had abandoned. When the tired, dusty collection of buildings that was Redemption finally appeared on the horizon, she felt no sense of homecoming. It looked small, fragile, and loud, a place of sharp angles and sharper judgments hunkered against the vast, silent wisdom of the land. Her arrival was not a triumphant return. It was a quiet spectacle. As she walked down the main street, a figure browned by the sun, her dress trail-worn and her hair unbound. Doors closed. Windows became frames for staring, disbelieving eyes. The familiar faces of her neighbors turned to stone, their expressions a mixture of shock, scorn, and a grim, self-righteous satisfaction. She was the fallen woman, the town's cautionary tale, returned from the wilderness that had surely claimed her soul. Whispers followed her like a cloud of biting flies. Look at her, shameless, the Indian's woman. The small brass bell above the door of Hayes's General Mercantile announced her with the same jarring jangle that had marked the beginning of her journey. The store was cool and dark, smelling of coffee and vinegar and all the safe, predictable things she had left behind. Her father was behind the counter, weighing out a sack of beans. He looked up, and for a moment, he did not recognize the woman standing before him. Then, his face went through a rapid, violent series of emotions, disbelief, a flood of desperate relief, and then a deep, settling wave of anger and shame. "Evelyn," he breathed, his voice a choked whisper. He set the scoop down with a trembling hand. That evening, the storm broke. He did not yell, which was worse. He spoke in a low, pained voice, his words laced with the bitterness of a broken heart and a ruined reputation. He demanded to know what had happened. where she had been, what the savage had done to her. Evelyn sat at the small kitchen table and met his gaze without flinching. The fear she had once felt for his disapproval was gone. She had faced down armed men and raging storms. His anger was just a different kind of weather, and she was no longer afraid of the rain. "He did not abduct me, Pa," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "He was a dying man. He asked for my help to get back to his home, and I gave it." She told him a version of the story, the truth, but a truth he could perhaps bear to hear. She spoke of a man's final wish, of a promise, of a long walk. She did not speak of the bounty hunters, or the ruins of a murdered village, or the profound, spiritual love that had bloomed in a cave during a rainstorm. To share those things with him would be a profanation. They were hers and Takakota's alone. Her father did not understand. He saw only the disgrace, the weeks of agonizing worry, the shame she had brought upon their name. "You threw your life away," he said, his face ashen. "For him?" "No, Pa," she replied, a deep, unshakable certainty in her voice. "I think, for the first time, I found it." The town of Redemption tried its best to suffocate her. She was a ghost at her own feast. Mrs. Gable would turn her back pointedly in the street. Reverend Miller paid a visit, speaking of damnation and the path back to God's grace, a grace she could only find by publicly repenting her sin. Evelyn listened politely and showed him the door. She resumed her duties in the store, her movements efficient and her demeanor calm. She weighed the flour and stacked the tins, but she was no longer the same girl. Her silence was not the silence of obedience, but of a deep, inner stillness. Her gaze, when it met the scornful eyes of the townsfolk, was not defiant, but clear and steady. It was the gaze of someone who had seen the world beyond their narrow horizons, and it unnerved them. She had become an enigma. They had expected a broken, shamed creature to crawl back, begging for forgiveness. Instead, they were faced with a woman of quiet, unshakable dignity. They did not know what to do with her. Her new life, her true purpose, began not with the adults, but with the children. They were not yet fully indoctrinated into the town's rigid prejudices. They were curious. They saw the change in her, the way she looked at the sky, the way she could identify a bird by its call. One afternoon, a group of them, led by a bold, freckle-faced boy named Sam, approached her as she swept the boardwalk in front of the store. "Is it true?" the boy asked, his friends hanging back, wide-eyed. "Is it true you lived out in the desert with a wild Indian?" Evelyn stopped sweeping. She looked at their eager, curious faces, and she saw not malice, but a thirst for stories, a thirst for a world bigger than their own. She thought of Takakota's final lesson: to die is to be remembered. She smiled, a small, genuine smile. "He wasn't wild," she said. "His name was Takakota, and he knew more about this land than any man in this town." She pointed to a set of faint tracks in the dust at the edge of the street. "You see those? He taught me how to read them. That's a roadrunner. See how the toes face both forward and back? He said it does that so the spirits don't know which way it's going." The children were mesmerized. From that day on, they became her silent congregation. In the quiet hours of the afternoon, they would gather near the store, and she would share the stories. She taught them the names of the constellations Takakota had taught her, telling them the Dine stories of the sky people. She taught them how to find north by the sun, how to know when rain was coming by the smell of the air. She did not preach. She simply shared the wisdom he had entrusted to her. She spoke of a people who lived in harmony with the world, of justice, of compassion, of a different way of seeing. She was planting seeds, small seeds of understanding, in the hope that one day they might grow into something that could break through the hard, stony ground of redemption. Her father watched from the doorway of the store, his expression a mixture of confusion and a grudging, unspoken pride. He did not understand the woman his daughter had become, but he could not deny her strength. One evening, a year after her return, Evelyn stood on the boardwalk as the sun set. painting the clouds in the same fiery colors she had seen from the high mountain ledge. The red dust of the street swirled around her ankles. The sounds of the town, a distant piano, the clink of glasses from the saloon, a mother calling her children home were a familiar backdrop. But her gaze, as always, was fixed on the eastern horizon, where the distant, hazy peaks of the red mountains were just visible. Like a promise, a cool wind, the same wind that had sung to her on that sacred ledge, blew down the street, rustling her hair and whispering against her skin. She closed her eyes, and in the quiet stillness of her soul, she could almost hear his voice, not as a memory, but as a living presence, as real as the wind itself. It spoke the words that had become the compass of her new life, the final, perfect benediction. You journeyed beside me, virgin, and now the world journeys with you. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales, and like this video. If this story moved you, please consider supporting it further by hitting the hype button to help it reach more listeners like you.